It was a time of desperation, a moment when the lights of the octagon dimmed to near darkness. The year was 2005, and the UFC, bleeding money and hope, stood on the edge of oblivion. Mixed martial arts was an outlaw sport, misunderstood, vilified, gasping for relevance in a world that refused to care. With bankruptcy looming, an unlikely lifeline emerged: The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show. Fighters living together, training, clashing in and out of the cage. It wasn't just a competition, it was a last stand, a gamble on human drama and raw ambition to save the UFC from the abyss. As the season unfolded, tension and stakes grew. The final episode wasn't merely a fight. It was an explosion of heart, skill, and grit that shook the foundation of the sport. Fans, new and old, were captivated. The sport didn't just survive, it ignited. This is a story of salvation, of risk, of resurrection, and this is examined in depth in episode 4 of Dark Side of the Cage on Vice. For now, we dig into some of the stories around the stories. This is Deeper Into the Cage, The Ultimate Fighter. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Deeper Into the Cage, or if you've never seen it before, welcome. Dark Side of the Cage is a 10-episode series on Vice examining some, of the most fascinating stories in all of fighting. This is called Deeper Into the Cage. My name is Robin Black. I am a martial arts lover, enthusiast, lifelong martial artist, and I got to be the creative consultant on this season 1 of Dark Side of the Cage. So what are we doing here? We're just seeing if we can dig a little bit deeper into these episodes, give you a few extra things to think about. And if you haven't seen the episode, I'm hoping that if you dig this, that you will watch it. And trust me, if you dig this, Dark Side of the Cage is way better than just me hanging out talking to you about stuff. But it is a gift to be able to do it. This week, we are talking about The Ultimate Fighter. On Dark Side of the Cage, it is branded as the UFC's ultimate gamble. Today, we'll talk to a few people that were really present for The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. Nate Quarry, who was part of Season 1. And Mike Goldberg, of course, who was right cage side seeing it all happen. So we're going to talk to both of them. We're going to examine little bits and pieces and tidbits and tangents, thinking out loud around that Season 1 Ultimate Fighter and how it really did, smash the UFC through into the mainstream. And, I promised a couple of weeks ago that I was going to try to give you a little snapshot of what it looks like to build a show like Dark Side of the Cage. I'm going to do my best to do that after we talk to our first guest. But let's get right into it. Let's do it. This is Deeper Into the Cage, The Ultimate Fighter.
16 fighters, one house, and a UFC contract on the line.
The naysayers were everywhere.
They had no clue what they were in for.
It was literally like animals claiming their territory.
Ridiculous challenges.
They want us to fight for free.
You asked for alcohol, I was there within a half an hour.
Are you surprised?
We didn't know if it was gonna work.
This isn't a character, man. This is my life.
Dana pounded on the table and said, it's gonna be bigger than the NFL.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.
Thanks again for hanging out with me. It's honestly a gift that anybody wants to sit and chop up some of these episodes with me. The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. Legend has it, and some legends are true, that the UFC was about to be zilch, done, go to zero, and that The Ultimate Fighter was the key breakthrough. And when you watch the episode of Dark Side of the Cage, there's no question that is the element that we show. But, as much as that is a snapshot in time, a real snapshot in time, moments are moments, and time exists before and time exists after. There are those hardcore UFC people, and most of them are now in their 50s, but who loved it before tough. If you were one of those people watching, at the time they called them tough noobs. The UFC was counterculture. It was edgy. It was punk rock. It was not something you told your friends you watched to a certain degree. It was outsider stuff. It was rugged and hard and jagged and tough. Broke a corporation through, made people billions of dollars, created what we know today, but it changed that forever, right? So that there are people, and some of them will be in the comments below on YouTube and listening on podcasts will hit me and Vice up on Twitter, I'm sure. There's a world of people who that counterculture UFC was what they loved. But when something is going to break mainstream, if you own a business and you want it to scale massively like you see on Shark Tank, you leave those people behind. So those people to some degree got left behind. Then there was the tough era. And that is where the episode of Dark Side of the Cage examines. And it is a wonderful story. It's an incredible story. In the context of Dark Side of the Cage Season 1, this story is very different from all the others. Because it is a process story, and it really is fascinating, and it really is a massive accomplishment for the UFC. And then there's the era after Tough. The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 was 2005. The moment we're sitting here talking, this is 2025. That's 2 decades. So we look at the snapshot, and again, that is what, that snapshot is the Dark Side of the Cage episode, and it is brilliant. But 20 years have elapsed, and this is how life works, these turning points where an entire world is created in that timeline since. What would have happened if it didn't happen? Well, some other company would have come up, some other sport would have happened. Who knows? It's impossible to guess. But in the years since, the UFC has become a massive, super powerful corporation. And although in North America and around the world, there's a lot of people who become fans of corporations. Corporations often are self-interested and about profit, and that's okay. But in pursuing profit, sometimes other things happen. That's why we're going to talk to Nate Quarry today, who was there day one, but he's also been a part of the story since. This is called shoulder programming. So shoulder programming means we are going to look at this awesome episode of The Ultimate Fighter, but we're going to use that as a leaping off point to examine other things within this hangout, within this podcast. So let's get into it. This is going to be a fascinating one. Thank you for being here. Let's get to our first conversation with Mike Goldberg.
I knew all these fighters better than any fighters I had called previously. I knew them by watching The Ultimate Fighter as a fan.
My guy, Mike Goldberg. Love you, man. It's great to see you again.
I love you too, my brother. Robin Black, truly one of the best in the business. And I do have to say to you, and I've said it to you many times, your breakdowns and the way that you take the physical and the mental and break them down, and then a bink or two are as good as anything out there in combat sports. And, we met many times. I think the first interview we ever did was with Bob Torrens when you came over and you were working with DAZN Bellator and you interviewed me. And I remember saying, like, I always knew Robin, but man, he asks really good questions. Wow. And this dude is smart. So much love to you. Huge respect for you since the day I met you. The only thing better than your breakdowns are you as a human being. So it's always a pleasure, bud.
My brother, thank you so much. And you're the best. You're the best there is, and you're the kindest guy, and I can't thank you enough. And thank you for the kind words, and thank you for hanging with me. And nobody judged me for leaving that in this. Nobody judged me for leaving that in this.
I'm the one who said it, so please do.
I love Mike, and it means the world to me, and I mostly just want my daughter to see that one day.
Play it twice.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much. And thank you for being in the Dark Side of the Cage episodes. This podcast, we're chatting about the Ultimate Fighter episode. And it was an interesting one because up until that point in the season, it's an individual person's story. Kimbo's story, Evan Tanner's story. This one is the story of a company overcoming things, a company like fighting to survive, correct?
Absolutely. A company that, if you talk to Lorenzo, I want to say it was 60 million in the hole, maybe 50 million. And there was that phone call that many people have heard the story, and you obviously know. There was a phone call one night. Lorenzo called Dana and he said, hey, you know what? We put a lot of money into this. We gave it a run, but we can't get out of that niche audience. We can't get people to understand what truly makes a mixed martial artist and what type of athletes and what type of people that we have fighting for a living. And he said, I'm going to give it till the morning, but this might be it. We might pull the plug here and see who can take it over. Then Craig Pelegian comes in with this idea of a reality show. And oh, by the way, Spike wasn't paying back then, and either was Pelegian. So it was another $10 million out of the Zuffa pocket to produce season 1 of The Ultimate Fighter. Now, years later, it translated to $4.2 billion. So I think it worked out very, very well.
Yeah, it's a wild one. And I mean, at the time, a TV exec or an expert in the business would have said, this is a terrible idea. You're going to pay money to go on a small network to show people under the hood of cage fighting. There would have been a lot of so-called experts that said it was a bad idea.
Absolutely. But what it was the best idea ever, because the world started to understand that these guys weren't coming from the street, and they weren't just thugs, and they weren't street fighters, and they weren't tough man competitors, that they all had a story. They had a personality. They put everything into their fighting, but they also put everything into their family. Bobby Southworth trying to get out of the sauna and just cussing out Chuck. I'm like, damn, even with the glass in between, you can't talk to Chuck Liddell like that, Bobby. You're not going to fight. You're going to make weight, but then Chuck's going to kick your ass. And just the personalities that we saw. Josh Koscheck, and as you know, people would make fun of me using this word, all the tomfoolery that we saw from Josh Koscheck, and then the battle of wit between Forrest and Stefan, and up and down the line, the Alex Karalexis and the Josh Rafferty, who came as that Cincinnati kid after Rich Franklin had kind of put Cincinnati and MMA on the map. So it was the greatest, because people started to understand that these were athletes, and these were high level athletes who had great discipline in and out of the cage. And it started giving people a reason, more so, to either wear like the white hat or the black hat. So Tito was the first. Tito will be the all-time best. But Josh Koscheck, coming off that show, became the guy wearing the black hat. So you would watch Josh Koscheck fight either to see him win or to see him get his ass kicked. And that's how it always was for Tito. But you know what you did with Tito? If you wanted to see him win or wanted to see him get pummeled, you pressed that button and you bought the pay-per-view. Yeah. And so it was a great way to get to the mainstream media. And what it started to me, Robin, was the way that the WWE, WWF back in the day always marketed themselves. They gave you some backstories. They gave you some freebies, another freebie. And then once every storyline was there, bam, they hooked you on WrestleMania, and it was brilliant. And so that pattern is one that eventually, with FS1 and the things that took over from there, all the periphery programming, that was the start of getting to know the athletes and understanding those who compete in mixed martial arts. And at that time, of course, specifically in the UFC.
Thanks, Mike Goldberg. I'm going to pull you in again for another one
I know
this
you are.
season, but it is so great to see you, my brother. Love to your family.
Thank you, and much love to your family, and a huge thank you to everyone at Vice, to you for hooking me up with the great people at Vice, because you know what, it's not easy not being the man at the UFC anymore. I mean, it breaks my heart, but what this opportunity did was it allowed me to take a look at the forest instead of being in the trees, Robin. And it has been nothing but joyful for me to be able to look back and for people to remind me that, Goldie, you were a big part of it. And that's not ego talking at all. That's just a man who loves people and doesn't mind getting some love back. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. I love you, man. Before we get to Nate Quarry, I promised the last couple of weeks, people ask a lot of questions about the making of Dark Side of the Cage. And I have some experience getting to make bigger television, but this is one of the coolest, it's the coolest thing I ever got to work on. And so I kept promising that I would give kind of an overview of how some of this works, and I realized an overview is impossible, but I'm going to give you little details into some of the early process today. And if people find this interesting, we'll continue in the coming weeks. I'll give you more I'll add more and more onto the story of how you make it. But so today there are 10 episodes of Dark Side of the Cage. January 2025 came out every Wednesday, and here they are. But this began 15 months earlier. A man named Dave Hodgson, who is the he is the series producer. Dave is kind of the big picture guy. He's the guy who has to have an idea on thousands of things. It sounds fun, but it also sounds really, really stressful. Dave Hodgson sat me down and said, I'm going to pitch to Vice. He's worked on Dark Side of the Cage and many of the other offshoots in the Dark Side series. He said, I'm going to go to Vice and bring them a story of what we could do with 10 episodes of Dark Side of the Cage. Would you like to sit in a sports bar with me and chat about it? And so we sat down, and early on, to me, Nick Diaz had to happen. You know, Nick Diaz to me was a mandatory. Dave had some great ideas. He still does. He's got a whole bunch of great ideas for season 2, should we be so lucky. Evan Tanner was one we talked about on day 1. And Diego Sanchez we talked about on day 1. And it starts out as literally you and a friend hanging out, chatting about fascinating stories. From there, he goes in and he builds them into what they could look like, how it's all built. And that process, once the show starts to exist, now you get what's called a story producer. And the story producer takes 2 or 3 episodes and they begin to piece that out. It is a highly, wildly complex thing. When you watch each episode, it feels like magic. Just the beauty of storytelling. But imagine getting every single one of those guests and piecing them all together and then reenacting all. It's wild. But it starts as just how you'd imagine it. A couple of friends sitting around talking about, wouldn't it be cool if we could tell these stories? Those stories eventually get expanded upon a little bit and dissected into possibilities, then presented to a network who eventually says, why don't you go ahead and do a little bit more work? You bring in other team members who start to help lay it out and coordinate it, and you begin to interview people. And the story isn't the story you thought often. Most often, you start to talk to people and they say, hey, this is what you didn't know about Nick Diaz. This is what the real story of Evan Tanner was. These are some things you didn't know about War Machine. Or then you get a chance to speak to some of these people. Dave spoke to War Machine in prison. And that's in episode 10. So, like I said, it is impossible. I certainly don't have the IQ to be able to lay out for you the whole thing. But at the very beginning, it is just like you might imagine. You're sitting around with some ideas. But from the ideas to what you see today is 15 months, probably a staff of 50, 80 human beings all working together, bringing together different skills and abilities, booking flights and sit-downs, light, all of these things. It's a wild thing. It's a wild thing. One of the wildest and most fascinating experiences ever. But what I'm hoping you'll do for me is in the comments, leave me some specific questions about the process of making of Dark Side of the Cage. Write me your questions about the process. There's all kinds of people that are creators in their own right and making their own content, social stuff, YouTube pieces. You're at the beginning stages of it. Ask me anything and I'll go to the experts. I'll go to the director. I'll go to the showrunner. I'll go to Dave and I'll bring your questions to them and I'll bring them back. And when we go into the final 5 and 6 episodes of Deeper Into the Cage, I'll try to answer some of those for you. But trust me, an incredible year-long process with dozens and dozens of brilliant people to bring you Dark Side of the Cage. And I'm glad people like it so far. One more conversation. I think this one's going to be fascinating. We're going to get Nate Quarry up in here, and he was there for day one of The Ultimate Fighter. But in the 2 decades since, he's got a real different view of the UFC. We're gonna get into that with him as well.
It is difficult enough to be around that many people day after day, but especially when you have no outlet whatsoever. We were not allowed books, no TV, no music. You're in pain all the time, you're sore, you don't know what the next day is going to bring.
You sat down and talked with Vice about The Ultimate Fighter Season 1. When you think back to that, was it a weird experience? What was it like?
Oh my God, it was so weird. I always tell people it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Being the first season and not really people that would watch reality TV, we had no idea what we were in for, didn't know if there was going to be fights. Just the insanity. And as I describe it to people, it's you take 16 idiots, lock them in a house, and see who's the toughest at the end of the day, and let the games begin.
When I reached out to you to sit down and chat with us about it, you described yourself as the adult in the room at the time. Did you feel like it?
I feel like that in most rooms, to be honest.
Yeah. But that
with the craziness that went on, to me, I saw it as such a great opportunity, possibly my final opportunity to become a professional MMA, make a career out of this. And so I'm very goal oriented. When I know where I'm going, when I know what I'm trying to do, that's it. From the very first night, everybody in the house is drinking and partying and hanging out. And they cut to me, I'm sitting in the backyard next to the pool, just mentally trying to prepare for what the next 6 or 7 weeks. We didn't even have any idea how long we were going to be there, but just trying to figure out what was going to be coming our way and what I could do to best be prepared for it.
I fought pro MMA, but at a much lower level. But I remember when I was getting ready to fight, I didn't know my opponent, and I looked, and the day of weigh-ins, I saw him smoking a cigarette. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a good thing. Did you have that thought when you were watching these idiots pounding straight liquor?
Well, it's such a small community, and we knew that the UFC was trying to pick some of the best unsigned guys around the country. So we knew who a lot of these guys were. I mean, Swick and Lieben had already fought. So I knew that there was going to be, no matter what the shenanigans were from the beginning, and I knew it was going to be tough. And I always prepared for every fight like it was the most important fight of my career, because to me, every single fight was. I can't imagine going to a fight saying, win or lose, I'll be okay. No, you don't want that L on your record. You go in, you try to put on the best performance possible, and that means being ready. And just that mindset saved me a lot of times, because back in the day, I would show up to watch fights, and a promoter would come up to me and say, "Hey, you're here. What do you weigh?" I'd be like, and I remember one time I said, like 205 something. And he goes, "Okay, don't eat anything. I think I got somebody who'll fight you." All right. And the next night I ended up being the main event and knocking somebody out in the first round. It was just always being ready to fight, always taking every fight very seriously, was just kind of my recipe for success.
What was some of the fallout from Tough? Like years later, where are some of the people now, and where did that lead?
After the fights, out of the 16 guys on the show, we've already lost 2 of them. Loden Sincade has passed. I still don't know why. I never heard any reasons of why he passed, and passed at such a young age. Stephan Bonner as well, passing. It sounded to me like it was some substance abuse possibly, and that it can be such a dangerous thing for guys to get into, because you're suffering from so much pain, and potentially you need surgeries. Maybe you don't have surgery, don't have insurance, can't afford the insurance. It's a very difficult thing. I look at compared to like athletes in the NFL, whose average career is roughly 3 years or so. The minimum pay for them, well, I just looked this up, it was somewhere around $700,000-$800,000 a year. So you're the worst player in the NFL, you're making $700,000. you're done when you're 25. You get out of college at 22, 3-year career, 25. You have a college degree. You just made $1.5 million, couple $1 million. You're still a young man. You can move on with your other dreams, goals, and that's it for you for football. Whereas in MMA, there's always this thing that you're reaching for that, to be honest, most guys will never achieve. And so they end up fighting way past their prime, taking fights they shouldn't take. I mean, just look at Muhammad Ali. As great as he was and all the things that he accomplished, he still felt the need to continue fighting well into advanced age when he shouldn't have. And it had really detrimental effects on him as he got older. So it's just not an easy road. As I tell the upcomers, train because you love it. If you want to fight and experience it, go for it. I think it's an important thing. Everybody should kind of test themselves in that manner, find out what kind of a person they are when they step in that ring. If it's something you enjoy, if it's something you're good at, follow through. But always have an exit strategy. Where are you going to go when this ride ends? Because let's say you're 35, you've taken a few beatings. Now the big show cut you. The smaller shows are the only ones that are interested. Former UFC fighter fighting for $2,000 on this card. That's not going to pay a month's bills for along your training camp and all the expenses and all that kind of thing.
For you, man, life after tough and life after fighting, you're up to a ton of things. Tell me about some of the things you're doing.
Since retiring from fighting, I continued on as a spokesman for the company that did my back surgery for quite a few years. When I had that, it was a spinal fusion. I was told by people, if you get back surgery, not only is your career over, your life is over, you'll never be the same. But I knew if I didn't get surgery, I knew the pathway I was going to be on. Just broken and crippled, unable to pick up my kids, barely able to walk. After getting my surgery and then returning to fight in the UFC, I became the spokesman for what's possible after back surgery. So I worked with them for several years. I've been doing real estate, built a few homes here and there, run some rentals. For me, I just want a peaceful life now. It's been a lot of fighting, a lot of pain. I'm not trying to take over the world. Unfortunately, it feels like I keep getting dragged back into things on occasion. We went to Washington, D.C. 7-8 years ago to work towards passing the Ollie Expansion Act that would protect MMA fighters like the Ollie Act does. Of course, promoters hate that kind of thing. They don't want the employees, the workers, the independent workers, as they would say, to have any rights whatsoever. The UFC wants to dictate who you fight, where you fight, when you fight. You have to tell them where you are at all times, what kind of clothes you can wear, what you can say, what you can do. They want to control everything, and giving any of that power back to the actual workers, well, that's not good for the people that are worth billions of dollars that are running the show. And so when we had a change of occupancy in the White House and Donald Trump took over, our bill was immediately killed, which of course was championed by Republican Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen, who said that this was his baby. His goal was to give fighters the protections that he didn't have when he was fighting. Wow. Well, now he is just completely in the MAGA camp there with Trump, has stated that he will not reintroduce the bill. Now, Senator Mark Wayne Mullen has made it clear that Trump does not want the fighters to have any protections whatsoever, because you'll see Dana White is always at Trump's parties, his balls, all that kind of stuff. The billionaires that are running things, not even behind the scenes anymore, just wide open, controlling things. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to get that passed. If so, it's going to take again a change in the White House. Again, Senator Mullen said that he would not support the bill as long as Trump was around. And quite frankly, I think the UFC is paying them too much money to even consider doing something for the people.
Whew. Awesome. Dark Side of the Cage, Season 1, it is on Vice. Vice Sports, Vice TV, Vice apps, Crave in Canada, where Chase and I live. It's a real joy to get to hang out with you on these podcasts, on these hangouts. And today was a really, really fascinating one. Next week on Deeper Into the Cage, Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz had not done a sit-down, long-form chat for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I mean, go look it up. Sorry, I'm not trying to boss you around. Look it up if you feel like it. But he hasn't done a sit-down for a long time. For reasons known only to Nick Diaz, when I called him, and it's not easy to track him down, and when I called him, he said, I'm going to do this. I want to do this with you. Stay on me. Stay on me. And trust me, I stayed on him. I've got some really fascinating stories about tracking down Nick Diaz for you next week, as well as some, well, we're going to dig into it. The Nick Diaz episode, I think, is really one of the great episodes that we got to do. I hope you enjoyed hanging out this week with me. And next week, like I said, Nick Diaz. Until next time, enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
16 fighters, one house, and a UFC contract on the line.
The naysayers were everywhere.
They had no clue what they were in for.
It was literally like animals claiming their territory.
Ridiculous challenges.
They want us to fight for free.
You asked for alcohol, I was there within a half an hour.
Are you surprised?
We didn't know if it was gonna work.
This isn't a character, man. This is my life.
Dana pounded on the table and said, it's gonna be bigger than the NFL.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.